Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Ulrike Hahn, who is going to tell us a little bit about how we need to reconfigure behavioral science to build a more effective COVID-19 response. Ulrike, I'm not going to give you much more introduction than that, as I'd like to save the time for both your presentation and what you have asked for, which is a hefty discussion afterwards. So without further ado, Ulrike Hahn, take it away.
Okay, thanks for the invitation to this great online event. Unlike the other talks, I'm actually going to be talking not about science, but about meta-science. And the project that I've been involved in since March on building an online community for a behavioral science COVID-19 response. So the initiative is called SciBe. It's about sort of reconfiguring behavioral science. And really it's about crisis acknowledgement through scientific community level responding. So how did we get there? Back in March, which as we've been over today, seems like a very, very long time ago. Things were going very wrong in the UK in terms of the policy response. And there was a real sense of having to get involved, even though I've never been anywhere remotely near policy in my life. I do very esoteric fundamental research kinds of things. And I and a bunch of colleagues of mine sort of sat down and thought about how we really would best respond as the wider scientific community, that is people who are not immediately on policy committees or scientific advisory committees to deal with this massive crisis. And so we wrote a preprint that we sort of slapped on SciArchive. That was a kind of discussion piece that we hoped would sort of start some kind of debate. And in that piece, we went through sort of various things that we thought people need from us as the behavioral science community at the moment. So for one, it was kind of clear expert advice and guidance was going to be necessary. It was going to be for that purpose to be necessary to sort of aggregate and present past relevant research. We don't just kind of want to reinvent wheels. But there were also going to be sort of new research that was going to have to target emerging gaps. And somehow that old and that new stuff had to kind of be meaningful combined. And all of this would have to be sort of distilled at work speed into a format that was policy suitable for public consumption, and also suitable for the media. So the question really we were trying to answer for ourselves from first principles is how we can achieve this speedily and transparently and with the best use of resources. And it seemed pretty obvious to us then, and it still seems obvious to me now, that just relying on a few prominent experts who happen to already be in policy advisory committees seems ill-advised. Last but not least, given the nature of the crisis, where any of us could become severely ill or die at any point in time. But also, even in March in the UK, despite the fact that the UK historically has had an excellent setup for these kinds of events, there were worrying signs that there was a sort of lack of disciplinary diversity in the policy advice body, and difficulties were emerging where people are finding it difficult to bridge across disciplinary gaps. So really, we thought what you want to do in a crisis like this, obviously, is just harness the full power of the wider scientific community. So the question is, how can you bring in that wider scientific community? And the way to do that, we thought and continue to think, was that you would sort of form some kind of transparent digital community-based forum for scientific exchange. And it would be transparent both to provide trust, but also to allow maximal scrutiny to ensure that you have robust responses. And if you had such a community-based forum, what you could do is you could simultaneously solve several key demands or challenges. On the one hand, you could stimulate collaboration and knowledge exchange by scholars talking directly to one another. You could boost the quality of new studies through early feedback, right? Because I can just say, I'm thinking of doing this study, and you could give me feedback and expertise on this, and that would allow us to sort of short circuit various loops that we normally step through in our normal science. But also we could use such a forum for rapid post-publication evaluation, critique, and integration with extant knowledge. Normally we do all of those things through subsequent research and subsequent papers. We now have to do this on a short time frame, and we need a means to do that. At the same time, such a digital forum would actually afford the sort of semi-automated construction of a large-scale knowledge base and be able to interface with such a knowledge base by virtue of being digital. And finally, such a forum could provide an interface to journalists or policymakers or citizens seeking to pose questions if such a forum had a facility for external sources to simply ask questions, a bit like a kind of black box, and then people would sort of zoom in to answer questions. And at the same time, by virtue of being kind of public and transparent, which means also that people are posting under their real names with their real academic affiliation and some indication of their expertise, it would provide a sort of dynamically evolving database of experts, which would be accessible both to other scientists, but also to policymakers or journalists, because extant databases of expertise, for example, in the context of learned societies that we have, are not fit for purpose in a crisis like this. They're backwards focused. They're about what did you do that made you well known 10 years ago, as opposed to what are you doing in this crisis now, where our very expertise is changing. So if we had such a forum, was the thinking, we could make use of all available resources and a broad and diverse range of perspectives by integrating researchers across career levels, institutions, and regions. And we wouldn't just be relying on a sort of hand-picked select few experts who are already in a position to speak to government. And so having kind of got to that point, we thought, well, there's no time like the present. We should just sort of try to put that into practice. And we made a start at building such an environment. So we created this sort of integrated environment of the sort of SciB initiative, which consists of a Twitter account, 3 subreddits, and a behind-the-scenes dynamic database project that I'm now going to kind of briefly introduce you to. So the first thing is that thinking there about how to build this, I spent a bit of time thinking about, building some kind of dedicated architecture, and you realize very rapidly that that's simply not logistically feasible on this sort of short time frame. So it was clear that we had to kind of go through with using extant social media and that already exists. And that comes with interesting kind of problems and challenges of their own, because of course these media aren't made for this particular purpose of science communication. But nevertheless, we set up a Twitter feed, and the idea about this Twitter account is to provide a high quality information feed that gives you sort of a daily digest of information about COVID-19 that should be relevant and interesting to you as a behavioral scientist. And at the same time, we set up the community forum proper, which is this set of 3 interrelated subreddits. So there's a Reddit that focuses on actual behavioral science research, new research or old research. There's one called Behavioural Meta, which focuses on meta discussion about how we should reconfigure our scientific processes for crisis response. And then there's the Ask, which is the forum that allows you to ask a question of a behavioral scientist as anybody, really. And for those of you who've never encountered Reddit, I'd never been on Reddit before I set this up. You can join these fora, but they're also just available to look at to anybody on the internet. And Ask, anybody can join. The other 2, anybody can join as well, but to post, you need approval to post, and you need to actually be a behavioral scientist. And then finally, behind this is a dynamic database project where we take the input from this Twitter feed and links harvested from the Reddit discussion, in addition to things that we look for systematically ourselves. And we use an integration tool to turn into a sort of GitHub thing. And then these get coded and added to an electronic online database that uses hypothesis.is. So our database is a database that lives in Hypothesis. Anyone can search it. It's publicly accessible. It has probably about 6,000 items now, and probably about 12 to 13,000 tags. And crucially, in distinction to other projects that have sprung up all over the world that are electronic knowledge bases, what's characteristic of our knowledge base and distinct is that it's made up of this eclectic material, right? It's tweets, discussion, Twitter discussion, newspaper articles, preprints, published reviews, and articles reflecting the fact that scientific discussion is happening across all these media at the moment, and it's happening in this sort of fragmentary form. It's not just happening in a published literature. So how far did we get with this? Well, we've had sort of some success in this, in that the community forum the Ask has been used by journalists seeking to pose questions. There has also been used at least once by government scientists wanting to know an answer to a question. And it's also been used to put together a study that ended up involving 7 countries and more than 15,000 participants to date. And there's a blog in the context of the Psychonomic Society digital event Research in Crisis that happened in May that details that. We also managed to sort of obtain a number of endorsements, on the one hand from the Association for Psychological Science, on the other hand from the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA, which is a policy body that run an amazing website where they're documenting pretty much in real time the COVID-19 response policies of over 200 countries in the world. And we had conversations with them. There is more information about these in a series of blog posts that appeared in this Psychonomic Society digital event that I'll just draw your attention to if you're interested. There's one on the Reddits and the community forum itself, and then there's also one that goes into more detail on the database. So in many ways, this is nice, but we also have to be kind of brutally clear that on some level, this is just proof of concept, right? It's done sort of some useful things, but it's far away from a sort of fully realized vision. And more is required to sort of fulfill the potential of this idea, which I continue to think is the right way forward. So what is it that's required? Well, the first thing that's required is scale, right? We have about 140 users, participants in the community forum. The Twitter account has about 500 followers. There are thousands of behavioral scientists out there that could be part of a project like this. And of course, any kind of crowd wisdom, crowd intelligence project like this just becomes massively more powerful as it scales. At the same time, there are a whole range of tools that we could use and that we are in the process of building that would improve the entire infrastructure. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those things in the remainder. Now, I think it's worth doing this, and I think it's worth carrying on with this, and I think it's worth thinking about where this is going and where it should go, because rather sadly, it's clear that the crisis won't be over for a while. And I think also the way the crisis is going, the role of behavioral sciences is only likely to increase as we have to deal more and more with the sort of societal fallout of the crisis. But at the same time, I think also this project should be of interest to people because it has utility beyond the crisis. Because if you think about conceptually what it is that we've ended up trying to start to build, it really boils down, I think, to trying to create from extant social media the kind of internet that scientists would actually need for science. That is an information environment that promotes content and network structures that are conducive to knowledge creation, aggregation, and dissemination. So some final thoughts on what is required to make this kind of thing work at scale, both in the context of the crisis and in the future as a kind of better internet for science. So I wanted to speak a few minutes on limiting factors of uptake that I think we've run into. I'm going to start with the last one. Obviously, there's a question here of getting the policy interface right. So we had the kind of disadvantage of starting to build this from a point where some of us have been involved in policy processes before, but none of us are directly in advisory bodies. And of course, you have to kind of gradually work out what it is that this knowledge brokerage process really requires. But there's also thought that has to kind of go into what it is that you as the wider scientific community can provide in that context. The key thing about the policy process is that to be useful, you kind of have to know the question, but if you're not already at the table, you don't necessarily know the previous question, and you have to be able to respond to those questions at the right speed. I think one of the things that we have been thinking about and coming to in interaction with policymakers about what it is that we're doing is that I think one of the things a forum like this can do is that behavioral science in general, I think might be less aimed at providing sort of ready answers or solutions than I might have thought at the beginning of the crisis. I don't think the kinds of research that we do tends to lend itself that well for telling policymakers this is how people are going to respond and this is what they'll do. I think that behavioral sciences are probably at their strongest in sort of setting out the sort of space of concerns and the possibilities and worries that one might have about human behavior. Because given the fundamental flexibility of human behavior, very detailed things are incredibly hard to predict. And there's a lot there that actually a forum can do in terms of anticipating future questions. But then there are also issues to do with the forum itself. There are things that we've worked out in trying to build this that limit the ability or willingness of academics to take part. One is sort of current perception of social media. I had more than one person say to me, I don't do Reddit or I don't do Twitter, where of course, the point of this isn't doing Reddit or doing Twitter. I too have, in my normal academic life, I do research that's relevant to the accuracy of our beliefs across social networks, and I've become incredibly skeptical of the role of social media in our society. But here, mere expediency means we have to do this, but it's quite hard to shake those perceptions. There are also then sort of seemingly innocuous design features of things, like what kinds of notifications you get when about whether somebody's responded to a post. That can make communication hard, that raise technical problems you have to solve. And then there are sort of more fundamental surprises that we've had in our case, like where are all the early career researchers? When I started this process and this project, I thought that one of the driving forces would be early career researchers. After all, they're the sort of media savvy, digitally savvy people. And in fact, we have tons of very senior people, and the level that's underrepresented are early career researchers. And there are sort of interesting structural reasons, both I think due to the fact that they're disproportionately hit by this crisis, but also to sort of where they sit in the context of scientific debate. And I'll get into that in a moment. And then finally, what also took even us by surprise was that the sheer flood of preprints has left even a forum such as ours in a position where you realize, well, most of these people don't want to discuss, there's not enough time, and you can't just do this in a spontaneous bottom-up process. You need to build new structures that deal with these processes. But I think what I really want to kind of leave you with is the sense that not only is this an interesting thing, an important thing, I think, for science to think about for the future, but I think also it's an important issue for us to think about as a scientific challenge. So one of the things we need to understand, I think there's three distinct sets of issues that we need to make progress with. One of the things we need to understand is what kinds of discourse rules and incentives promote scientific progress in this kind of forum. And I thought I would use a kind of trivial example not trivial example from yesterday. So yesterday in one of the talks, somebody used a measure that I happen to think is kind of scientifically problematic or discredited. So I'm sitting there in this digital context thinking, do I say something about this or do I not? And I think from the perspective of science, it makes sense to say something. But of course, this is happening in a wider social context. We're now conducting sort of transparent public exchange. And unfortunately, it's in the nature of a lot of scientific exchange that we need to be critical of things. But in this public situation, I now also have to factor in that the speaker is a PhD student. I'm a senior academic. How is that going to play out? There's also the fact that the work that I think discredits these measures happens to be my own. Does that mean I'm just going to kind of come across as sort of self-promoting? How do we deal with all of these factors? And importantly, those factors aren't just relevant to me and the speaker, they're also relevant to everybody hearing this exchange because they shape perceptions about the nature of the discourse and whether people feel comfortable saying things in this discourse and feel comfortable taking part. So there are real design decisions about how we can make an inclusive, constructive, yet critical exchange in a context where things are so transparently widely available and will persist in time. The second thing I think that we need to look at is what kinds of algorithms we can use to promote the maximization of knowledge creation. So social media, as you will know, are not just people talking to each other. This is an algorithmically mediated public discourse where the algorithms that run Twitter, Facebook, or Reddit are algorithms for maximizing advertising revenue. Now, it seems extremely unlikely that those algorithms will be suitable for maximizing knowledge creation. And there is research on thinking about how you could best bring people together to ensure diversity across areas and bring together the right types of area. And there's fascinating work going on in the sort of science of science, natural language processing, trying to find documents and areas that should be brought together. And so this area sort of shades into current research about machine tools for knowledge aggregation and evaluation, which we're going to need when dealing with a flood such as this. And I realize I'm already kind of getting close to where I wanted to stop because I wanted to leave time for discussion. So I'm just going to mention two sort of cutting edge things in this context. COVID Scholar at the moment, which uses unsupervised word embeddings, and the Ceres 2030 project on food sustainability, which you'll be hearing more about in the autumn. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that's sort of given an impression of what the issues are and what the challenges are. Please do join us in this initiative, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ulrike, for that very important, I think perfectly timed talk as we come to the close of these 3 days together, hearing about how much data has been collected as a result of the pandemic, or because we're all trying to better understand the nature of the pandemic and how it's affected us. I think we do have a question from Bahatung Cenk from the chat, which I will start with. She says, does this kind of a forum actually open up the opportunity for new posts, either research or otherwise, for somebody to draw the bridges, to draw the links between studies, to analyze data? And this is a worry I've had and so acutely over the last few days, how much data is being collected, and the worry that a lot of it might go unanalyzed, unused. So I wonder if you have some ideas, and maybe this is part of your master plan, but to ensure that there are people to do this work, not just algorithms.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the forum is relevant in this or potentially relevant in this process in multiple ways. One is that I think, of course, with the intention with which it was set up, if people used a resource consistently, where they kind of told people about what they were planning to do in advance, and you know, only a few studies have used our forum that way, then of course there's an opportunity to kind of avoid reduplication, but also to join forces. At the same time, there is one study that's gone through this forum where it's been public and transparent at every stage, including the data. So the data were always publicly available. The analysis was happening in real time. You could see that on GitHub. It was being reported back on the forum. And there, I think the benefit of that is that that provides a vehicle for people to join in. Right. I think if we want to be effective in not just in something like this pandemic, but I think also in science going beyond, we need to move to more collaborative ways of doing science. Right. And I think the open science movement has been thinking about these kinds of things for a long time. I think it's partly about the tools, right? Having a forum like this, that means that you can find out what's going on and know where to join. But I think also we have to think about the incentive structure in science, and we have to change that, right? We have to become comfortable with people doing many more and different kinds of things and being co-authors for different kinds of things, so that you can have large multi-author papers, as we have in other disciplines like physics or medicine, right? Where it's okay, so that for people to say, oh, look, I think I could add something to your data analysis here, and you as an author go, oh yeah, that would be great, right? As opposed to us being this sort of competition of little units all doing our own thing, which I think is probably already not great in normal science, but is completely dysfunctional in something like the current epidemic context.
So I think it's about sharing, and I think you're absolutely right. So I mean, your portal is obviously about sharing, and one of the sort of requests that I think has come out of your slides is, you know, a request for help in building up this forum. It can only be as useful as the range of the users. And so one of the things that struck me is we have to figure out how to target specific users, whether it's the people adding the data and the science, as well as the people who might want to better understand and ask questions. And so I wonder on the ask side, how are you targeting, or do you simply just assume that people know that the forum exists, or have you specifically gone to the various media outlets and said, look, this exists, you know, come to us?
Yeah, we haven't gone. So one of the things that we have done is when we've had journalist requests, is just say, like, you know, could you just pose that question there? Because then somebody else can look at the answer. So we haven't really specifically targeted the media in any way. We have been spending time talking to trying to talk to sort of various levels of policy bodies and people involved in the policy process. I think in all of this, right, it's the difficulty with building something like this is that it's a feedback thing, right? The more people use it, the more people contribute, the more useful it is. And you have to kind of get into the right space for these positive feedback dynamics to take over. I think also we're in a position where fairly limited additional resources. So we've been doing this entirely as volunteers, right? With no financial or other support. And there's all kinds of things that you could do, I think, that are quite straightforward, for example, from a machine learning perspective, that would make this much easier and more powerful to use, in addition to it having more users. And those two things would mutually reinforce each other too. But almost all of the funding, I think rather bizarrely to me, in this crisis has been on like actual science projects. There's been literally one call to which we have applied and are waiting to hear from that gave any kind of money to any kind of meta science. Even though I think it really merits a crisis like this, thinking like, how do normally science is glacial in its speed, right? Now we're supposed to do it at warp speed. How we preserve the integrity and scrutiny of the normal scientific process in this hugely accelerated world? Those are deep questions.
So maybe picking up on that point, which, trying to play devil's advocate and having preprints out there myself, what are we supposed to be doing as we go forward? And, in a world of your, I can't remember what word you used, it was so good, but this sort of preprint, just overwhelmed with a number of preprints, which is not peer reviewed. So how much can we trust it? And we are going at warp speed, which means mistakes can be made, things haven't necessarily been checked. What do we do as a community now that preprints have become such a staple and an important staple? I mean, it is so important that while you're still figuring things out, that you can get feedback, whether it's in the form of a conference like this, which I obviously am biased in thinking is the way to go, but preprints is another way.
Yeah, I think my intuition is that, so I think one of the things that's been interesting to me is that I think what hasn't happened in with psychology preprints is that there hasn't been massive online discussion of them in the way that there has been for epidemiological or medical work. I simply haven't seen that, despite spending several hours every day looking at what's happening. And on the one hand, you might say, well, that's kind of an answer too, right? So if most of these preprints are just kind of being ignored, maybe that was the answer. They're not doing any harm, right? If they have mistakes, but it is still an incredible waste of resources. I think probably that the majority of these are going through eventually the normal journal route, so they'll get there somewhere. But I think the thing that I've come to convince myself of is that I think this process needs more structure. Like, I think people in the open science community were overly optimistic that, yes, there's comments happening on social media. There's a lot of reviewing happening outside of journals already. And so I've been actually writing a piece with Alex Holcomb, who's been interested in this for a long time, on how to do this maybe in a bit more a sort of semi-structured way for preprints. And I think one of the things you have to do there is you have to sort of think at the various multitude of functions that the normal journal process has in terms of structuring attention, getting people to actually do things. A lot of these are non-obvious, right? And you sort of have to even though we do it all the time, and we're going to have to rebuild that, I think, in a preprint world.
I mean, I think I have two suggestions, as it seemed like you were looking for,
yes,
people's feedback on the forum, and it seems to me that maybe it seems redundant, but that theoretically there you can, if you think of it as an R&D pipeline, you have things that are at earlier phases in that research and development pipeline, where what you really want is to make sure that you're only getting feedback maybe within and across disciplines, but not necessarily sharing that. And that's really where the preprint can go down the wrong route, is that it falls into the wrong hands. And that, things like your structured form allow preprints to be put out there for feedback from people who might be able to do that, just to provide feedback. And that then and the question is who makes this decision, but as soon as it has become a product that is viable, as it were, and useful, that it then becomes something that can be more widely shared. So it's a filter of sorts. What kind of peer review? Is it going to be something that is going to compete with typical peer review? I think these are some of the big questions, obviously, that you're probably wrestling with. I wonder also about your point about transparency of criticism, right? I think your point is really something I've been thinking about, because I've been putting one leg in a very different field, in that of philosophy, where things are done quite differently, I think, to the way they're done in the empirical sciences. They have, on the one hand, these very long extended back and forths in the form of commentaries and letters, and which I think is sort of what we want, but in a shorter time scale, hopefully. But on the other hand, that when criticism is made, it is quite personal, I think. And I think that that's something I've always thought we as empirical scientists do pretty well. But I think that you're trying to say that when that criticism is not in the form of a one-shot conference, traditional conference, but rather something that's up there forever, whether it's on an open peer review or open comment section, is there an etiquette that we need to start to follow? Do we have to change our expectations and so on? So I wonder if you have ideas. I mean, I know you flagged it up as a problem, but what do you think are solutions?
Well, I mean, I think I mean, I think the thing is, we have to, as best possible, all move to a position or a sort of state of mind in engaging this kind of discourse where we realize that people, that being criticized, that having problems pointed out is helpful, right? That's going to allow us to do better work, and that it's a constructive thing, and they have to be offered in that tone, and they have to be accepted in that tone. The question is, how can you shift to that, right? Like, so with the example I was using, like I've always had this policy in the past that when, this is not about this talk that I mentioned, but you're at a conference and a speaker says something that you think is really problematic, like to the extent that you think it undermines the talk. I've always had this personal policy of not actually asking a question, but just going up to the person afterwards in person and saying that. Right.
I think that's the point, right? I think that I think we do have social norms that guide our behavior and how we should behave.
That's right.
So I think if we follow those, and most importantly, I think it does rely on expectation. I think people are having to shift their expectations that we do live in a much more public world and a much more fast-paced world. You might have put your publication out there into the public domain and then waited for those emails that we all dread, where somebody writes back and says, I don't really think your figure is what you say it is, and we've all had it at some point or another, and we do dread it. But in the new world, this can happen, almost instantly. You put your preprint out and the feedback comes at you, and in some cases it's constructive. But I think, as you say, that maybe some people are not being guided but by the etiquette and norms we would normally use. So I think maybe you're right. Maybe some sort of public discussion has to be had amongst ourselves.
Well, I think also we might need to preserve different elements of things that we do already, even in a digital context, right? Like there might be, for example, a case for phases where you discuss ideas without knowing whose ideas they were. Yeah. Right. Where you do make some of the discussion anonymous, or you do make some of the discussion ephemeral, right? But yeah, I don't have answers. And I think there are also empirical questions where we have to try things and then see, computational social science can do that and see what impact it actually has on the results of discourse. Like, I think these are all empirical issues that we should be treating as research questions going forward.
Absolutely. I'm going to have to just tell you that we've unfortunately had to just receive an email from Jay van Bavel, who is, for personal issues, not able to join us today. So first of all, I have to just transmit his sincerest apologies for the short notice and the cancellation. His work, however, is already published and can be found. And I will pop the link to that into the YouTube chat when I'm finished speaking with Ulrike. But it means that we have a little bit more time to discuss what I think is such an important topic. So I don't know whether you have time to do so, Ulrike.
Yeah, sure.
So, I mean, to go back to this this issue raised by Baha, which I think is something that you care quite dearly about as well, which is funding for these meta science initiatives. And I think that you've said that you've applied for the one and only call. What can we do? I mean, we have to be proactive. We have here a list of 37 speakers on a particular topic who've, highlighted the need to exchange ideas, to talk collectively and plan collectively for the future. There's clearly a need. How do we find more funding for these kind of? And I think what Baha was suggesting, I don't know if this is in line with what you want the funding for, but I think that she might be right, that we need it for, on the one hand, human resources, people to go and draw these lines and do the work that you've been doing so painstakingly as a volunteer, but also perhaps for resources to make the forums do some of the things you think that the tools like Twitter and Reddit are maybe not made for, as you suggested. So I wonder if you could talk a bit to how we can drum up more funding and how you would use it.
Yeah, I think I can say more about how I would use it first, and then maybe something about. So I think there at the moment there are. I would like to start building a kind of meta architecture on top of Twitter and Reddit, so that you don't, as a user, feel you have to go through Twitter and Reddit, right? Because I think even that detachment would help with some of the issues that we have. There are annoying niggling design features of Reddit, for example, like it will tell you when there's a new post in the forum, and it will tell you when somebody's replied to a comment you made, but it won't tell you generically if somebody has added a new comment to a post somewhere. And that's terrible for a debate like ours, which happens at a kind of slow pace, right? Like, it's never going to be the case that this is going to be at a warp speed like Guardian comments or something, right? Like, scientists are going to dip in and out. You want this to be cumulative. So you need a tool that tells you, oh, there was something that I last looked at 2 weeks ago, but there's something new in that thread. And something as trivial as Reddit not having that is a block, right? And so I think with fairly limited resources, you can, because of the way Twitter and Reddit are set up, they have APIs where you can machine interact with them. You can build things on top of that, right? To used in different ways.
So you use the interface, but with bespoke tools.
That's right. So that you're actually interacting it in your own environment in a browser that looks quite different and lets you do different things. And I think in general, we want to draw on more sort of machine learning tools and knowledge integration tools to help navigate the complexity, right? Like, so I've been spending, for example, a huge amount of time on Twitter every day trying to find relevant material. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? So you know that it's already a flood, but I'm also well aware of the fact that there's more out there, right? And there are available tools that would allow us to access that better.
Can I just ask you, if you stop sharing your screen, we can see you in as there's widescreen and technicolor, as they used to say in the old days of cinema. We have Baha as well joining us.
Better?
And it will make for a little bit more of a round table experience.
Oh, okay.
And I assume, Baha, you've joined us because you have something particularly important to say. So I will let you say it.
Well, I just, yeah, you kind of touched on it already, but I agree that it's very important to merge different databases and all the information that's out there. But I feel like what's equally important is to make sense of that information at the end, right? Even if we had the perfect platform, which we currently don't, but once we get to that stage, it's yet another job to integrate all the information. And as scientists, we know best what the caveats are in all sorts of databases that perhaps policymakers wouldn't necessarily know. So, and that becomes more of an issue, I think, for behavioral sciences, which have perhaps a bit larger confidence intervals in general than something like physical sciences. Yeah. So yeah, I'm just wondering, that was where I was trying to get at with my question of, having some assigned roles in some sort of capacity. I don't know if academia is the right place, or perhaps we need a different institution that is more in a cross-sector, so to say, not just academic, but also has a leg in applied disciplines, so that people who are expert enough to speak about a topic, but also knowledgeable enough about the practical needs of the environment.
Yeah, so two comments on that. One starting with the end, I completely agree that you can't do this meaningfully without some access to people who are directly in the policy process and know what the policy process needs, right? You minimally need their input, and ideally you also need their current questions, right? And I think it's been, if I think there's a failing of the, I think there's many people and many bodies who've done admirably well in the crisis, but I'm still surprised by how restrictive much of that has been, right? Like, so I'm a member of, professional organizations that have been dispensing government advice, and you sort of think, how is it that I, as a member, of that organization have no idea how that government advice is coming about, even though it's in my area. Like not only is there a kind of a resource that I think is not being optimally used, but I think there's also transparency issues that are a concern. But of course, that access to the policymaker is scarce, right? But I think the people who are directly involved in that process doesn't have to be the policy. I think there's general information that can be passed on to people with projects such as ours to make them more efficacious. But on the knowledge aggregation thing, I completely agree that I think it's unlikely that we're ever going to be able to let all of this knowledge evaluation and aggregation be a machine process, right? I think that the goal is to use machines as far as we can to leave the important judgment calls to us and facilitate those. And I have to say, I've learned quite a bit in the last few months that have made me realize actually there's quite a bit that's gone on in the last few years in natural language processing that mean that boundary is a little bit further along than I thought it was. So I didn't really have time to sort of talk about this CERES 2030 project on food sustainability there, but it's a huge project that I found quite inspiring in many ways, in that it involved seven research teams from 5 different continents with hundreds of researchers. And they were trawling largely through the gray literature on agriculture and food security. And they built with sort of present open source tool. This is Jaron Porcello's group. Tools to identify the sort of key papers and key questions that the human research teams should then focus on. Right, so I think there's an awful lot that can be done in preparing out what the things are that we should be focusing on. Yeah. And helping us in better ways to find the things so that we can precisely deploy the kind of human bit that's the really hard and really sciencey bit in a more targeted fashion. And yeah, I think ultimately with respect to the funding, which was the question that we got started up, I think that has to come sort of from sort of charitable organizations, the public sector and the research councils, right? Because I think what we're ultimately looking at is that I do think we need a new internet for science. And I think it's going to be really important that that internet for science is owned and run by scientists, right? So for example, there's interesting work on thinking about how do I connect people up in a social network such as to maximize accuracy, right? And so you can think of algorithms that you can then test that look at whether, they say, oh, you like Baha, Ulrike, these are 2 people in this social network. This is what they've been talking about. It would be useful if they spoke. Sorry. And I'm going to put them together. You can do that, something like that technically, and you can also empirically look at whether that's beneficial or not. But we have to own those algorithms, right? We have to be as scientists, be able to then say, well, we tried that wasn't good. Now we want to change this. In Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, all of these things are beyond our control. And so I think the first thing that we're going to need is that this is going to have to be a public good. And it's going to have to come from funders who are interested in building and investing in that kind of public good. And I think that's really going to narrow down where the funding can possibly come from.
Now, I wonder if I can play devil's advocate, Ulrike. And so I have one question as a devil's advocate, and then as, again, kindly to ask for your input. So the first question is, we have internal bias, and if it is a science, internet for scientists, but which is purely run by scientists, don't we run the problem that we already have to deal with, which is that we're not always as effective as we think at communicating our data. I don't say that this is a problem that everybody has, but clearly is a problem that we either are, as we heard earlier today, too cautious. We don't want to risk run the risk of saying something we can't prove, and so we don't say that at all. Or that we are too quick to report something that isn't verified and hasn't been replicated. If it is an internet for scientists, run by scientists, don't we really need somebody there to say, actually, that isn't clear, or that isn't serving the public good.
But don't we kind of do that in normal science as well? I mean, it's not like everything about normal science is wrong, right? Like in normal science, we publish papers too hastily and they turn out to be stupid, or we're dysfunctional because we can't let things go because we're too thorough, and then they're amazing, but they get ignored because somebody else has already stolen the show. And you know, science is supposed to be this sort of slow self-corrective process, and it does that better or less well. I mean, we already kind of live in that world, and we already kind of run it as science. I mean, there are, you know, commercial publishers and universities and other factors in it, but ultimately it is sort of run by like we have some control over it as scientists, and I don't think that changes just because you're moving this to sort of an online thing, right? I think the way to deal with all of these things, and the way we should also be dealing with it in the context of normal science, is that I think you need kind of to be clear about the kind of metric. You need metrics. You need to be clear about what your goals are. You need to be clear about how you would evaluate those goals, and you need to treat those things themselves as empirical questions that science is trying to bootstrap its way into doing better science, and figuring out how to do those things in better ways. Maybe that's naive, but that's
no, I don't think it's naive at all. I just think that if we're going to be asking for money, people, specifically with the goal of serving the public good, and that will certainly be the case with you know, data about COVID-19. It's to you know, there's science for academic curiosity's sake, and then there's science for public good. I think it should all be related to public good. I don't necessarily believe in science just for academic curiosity, to be honest, but that's just an opinion. However, I do think that yeah, internal bias is an issue, and something that might convince funders is that moving in this new direction might hopefully go towards countering that bias. I mean, I'm just trying to think of selling points to funding bodies, whether they're research councils or charities, is we have to make the point that this is not a new problem, and not a problem that will be solved by simply, you know, taking on the baggage of the past, but that we'll have new solutions, new ways of ensuring that our science communication is in fact that it is communicating science in a clear and effective way. So I think I just worry about a science only you know, governance. I think that I'm all about interdisciplinary, and maybe.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I see also. Yeah. So I do think that's important, right? And I think there's and it's important because ultimately this has to be policy responsive, and I think science has to be policy responsive on some level too. And I think that's also going to become only more apparent the more transparent it actually is. I think some important questions that I don't have kind of clear intuitions on at the moment, right, is that there are different aspects that at the moment are already shifting to online, and many of these changes are already happening. There is more and more science on Twitter, for example, and more scientific debate. And I'm not sure that different aspects are all well served by being in the same communication. So in the context of COVID, you have critical discussion of preprints. You have Independent Sage, which is now sort of a rival government policy body holding open meetings, live streamed on YouTube and live commented on Twitter. And you have the general public engaged in discourse with scientists on Twitter. And one of the things I'm unsure about is that while we need to have all of these different discussions, I think it would be good for science to have these. I'm not sure they all need to be in the same medium. So it might be, for example, that you want to have the science. So the way we've set it up at the moment, right, with the community forum, is that really what the policymaker or the journalist does is interact in a very particular interface, but doesn't disrupt the discussion of the scientists per se. And that might be good or that might be bad as a design feature, right? And it might be good to not let the general public sort of wade into the science debates, or it might be bad, right? But I think those are questions too that will require sort of further research and sort of careful consideration.
Leading us into the next part of our program, which is really to focus in on mental health. One thing we really haven't discussed is, I mean, we've talked about scientists, but obviously we need the buy-in of clinicians for a lot of, at least the COVID-related research, which is, focused on, and thankfully so, on the effect on mental health. Clearly, the discussion between scientists and clinicians needs to also be facilitated. And there, the assumption is hopefully that there is a smaller gap to bridge, because most clinicians are scientists at heart, if not by training. And so is there any way that you can see us moving forward so that the basic primary science that we, I think everybody here is doing, can ensure that that information is getting to the people who need to use it on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I don't know how we can ensure that. I mean, I think it's the goal. I mean, I think like the frustration, the worry at the beginning of the crisis for me, and the continuing frustration as it's unfolded for me, has been that we know so much in kind of meta science and the philosophy of science, and in all kinds of formal computational contexts. We know so much about how epistemic diversity really matters to the quality of outcomes. We know so much about how it's important to have a broad range of perspectives, and that's not just about being nice to people and giving them a voice, but that really makes the science better. And I think that's the thing first and foremost that I've been trying to build, but it's also the hardest part. It's the hardest bit, that you don't just recreate now in some new online forum the community and disciplinary silos that you already had. And it's hard, I think, in part because you are in one or more communities, right? And you really have to find the right people in these other communities that will take their community by the scruff of the neck and say, look, guys, these people over here want to talk to you. Let's get this discussion going. And all of that is not going to be a matter of infrastructure, right? The infrastructure and the tools are going to make that possible. But at the end of the day, it's still going to be down to people, actual individual scientists, actual individual clinicians, to say, yes, that I can understand, that discourse is valuable and I have to contribute to it. And that gets us back to the incentive structures again, right? Like we have to change, I think, science in such a way that it's like being a good departmental citizen, right? It's like the person who goes to every departmental talk and and asks bright questions, but doesn't get promoted because they don't, bring in big dollar grants. You have to. There are wider sort of systemic issues that we're fighting with that are not going to be changed overnight just because it's in a crisis, sadly.
I mean, I'd like to think that there, and you've pointed to solutions. I think we have to focus on solutions rather than on what are glaring problems, and problems that I'm sure all of us three here who work more in a disciplinary way are so keenly aware of. But I think incentive structure is one, and it's a very obvious one. But I would probably reiterate that, having now worked in interdisciplinary work for a little while now, it really is a lot about ensuring that people understand what you're saying. It's a lot about the language we use. And I think one thing, at least I've been trying to do throughout this conference, and which I'm so grateful to so many of the speakers for doing so as well, is ensuring that the message is received in a format that anyone can understand. And obviously there's a trade-off with quality and precision, but it doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. And I think that one thing we can all work towards doing is making sure that our message is indeed that, a message which is sent with an intended target audience, and to assume that we are trying to reach a broader audience, rather than, making sure that we've put in as much jargon in there to sound intelligent. So I think, sort of as a closing point, I think what you've really highlighted, Ulrike, and I want to thank you again, is that we need to rethink, and it's not going to be just because we have a fancy forum, and it really is. So congratulations on all the hard work on creating that. But it's that we have to rethink how we do our science, and how we do it collectively, and how we share it with a broader audience. So I think it's homework for us all, And hopefully we can make use of the tools that you've put together. I think this conference is another one of those tools, and I very much hope that you and others will continue to use it as a way to promote interdisciplinary work. But I think, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to look for solutions, and incentive structures is definitely one of them. And I think my contribution will be that science communication is key.
Okay, thank you very much.
Not at all. I thank you so much, and thank you, Baha, for hopping on so that we could have an even more interesting